On behalf of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, I would like to join Emily in welcoming you to this final community conversation held in conjunction with the Levine Museum's Changing Places exhibit. And I want to thank Emily for giving us the opportunity, giving the university the opportunity to collaborate on this exhibit and to help spark dialogue on this very important topic. As Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, I'm very excited that several of my faculty members in the Department of Geography and Earth Sciences are participating in this final culminating event. When you're Dean of a college, all of your faculty are like your children. And so when they're up on stage, you just kind of go, yes, and then you go, oh, but don't mess up. And I'm sure, I heard Heather and Bill today, and I'm sure that they, on Charlotte Talks, and I'm absolutely sure that they won't mess up. Because of this series, the university has had the chance to share our intellectual capital and resources with the community in order to enhance dialogue on topics that affect all of our lives. Further, the collaborative effort in these conversations between faculty and community experts and stakeholders is the precise model of engagement with the Charlotte community that the university identifies as one of its central missions. Emily kind of stole my thunder in terms of talking about some of the really important and signature panels that have occurred over the last year and a half. In the college, we sponsored a panel on race and justice. We sponsored a panel on keeping the faith, the changing face of the city, LGBT Charlotteans, Charlotte's creative class. But certainly my college was not the only contributor. Other topics included trends and outlooks for jobs and recovery in Charlotte, building and maintaining sustainable neighborhoods, how the arts reflect the changing cultural demographics of the Charlotte region, and just last month, our rock star, the head librarian Stanley, brought together a powerful presentation about desegregation and race in the Charlotte school system, featuring readings by actors of letters and other original documents from the library's special collections that trace the still controversial debate back to its origins. But the key to the success of the series wasn't the expertise of the faculty or the community panelists. It was something that came at the end of every evening, the question and answer session. And that's where this group can't mess up. I had the opportunity to witness a spirited but civil debate among the audience after the panel we sponsored on race and justice. And I'll never forget the final question when one person stood up and said, "You've got easy answers for easy questions, but I have a question for you. What are we going to do about it?" And that was the question of the evening. It was the question, I think, of the series. I feel that that moment, as uncomfortable as it was, and it was uncomfortable, represents the success of the entire series. By means of the panel was created an opportunity for dialogue. That evening, the panelists, faculty and community members alike, weren't talking to each other or across each other. We were talking with each other. And only out of such dialogue can effective change occur. It's been clear from these conversations that the panelists certainly don't have all the answers. What we've tried to do with the Levine Museum and with this series is to just get the conversation started and get people talking about those issues that affect our lives, our children's lives, our neighbors' lives. And this evening's topic, with contributing authors from Charlotte, North Carolina, the global evolution of a new South City, is certainly one of the best examples of these important issues. And now, so that we can get this particular conversation started, I will turn over the podium to Tom Hanchett, the museum's on-site historian. Thank you.
Well, what we're going to do tonight is we have about an hour together, a little bit more, and we will sample a few of the authors in this fine new book, get a sense of what it's about. We have a number of authors that aren't on the program who are here. I hope will chime in, and then we have time for that kind of robust audience participation, question and answer, comment time in which you all become part of the story. So that's kind of where we're going. And we'll start off with Dr. Bill Graves. Bill Graves and Heather Smith conceived this book many years ago now. University of Georgia Press took it on. And it is wonderful to hear about it on the radio today, to actually hold it in our hands. They gather together professors and scholars from a number of departments of the university, a number of places in the community, and they are going to, they grappled with, where are we now? What kind of history are we making today in this new South City? So with that, let me bring forth Dr. Bill Graves, PhD in geography from University of Georgia. He will be talking about Charlotte's evolution as a new South City, particularly, are we still Southern? Bill Graves.
First of all, I'd like to say thank you all for coming out. It's really gratifying to see such a large crowd here for a conversation about this project that Heather and I had worked on for many years. Before we get started with the serious business of the evening, however, I'd like to make a confession. And that confession is back when Heather and I first started talking about putting this book together, honestly, my first thought about a title was to call it Global Mayberry. And in my defense, it only took me about an hour or two to realize that was a really bad idea. However, the title stuck with me, and it stuck with me because I think it does a pretty good job of communicating this relationship that exists between the global and the Southern. And frequently when we think of globalization, we think of it as eroding local identities. And what many of the authors in the book have found is that, in fact, the global is very much a part of Charlotte's DNA, and in many ways it's, in a sense, enhanced our Southern identity rather than eroded it. I've got two quick examples I want to go through to illustrate this symbiotic relationship with the global and the Southern. Bear with me if you would. The first and certainly most important example is the quintessential local meal. This was actually my lunch this afternoon. I got the smoked chopped pork, got the coleslaw, the cornmeal and the hush puppies, and whatever is in the Brunswick stew. That's certainly local material. But the surprising thing about this lunch is the thing on the top right. The iced tea is actually, believe it or not, a global import. It's not a Southern invention by any means. The cheap sugar, ice machines, and the ingenuity to combine those ingredients is an import from the wider world. And I certainly, as a native Southerner, could not say that iced tea has eroded my Southern identity by any means. So this is probably certainly my favorite example of the global, in a sense, enhancing the Southern. A slightly less important example, in my opinion, is the rise of Charlotte's most visible industry, banking. And I'm sorry about the graphic being low down there. I apologize for that. It's a quote from Hugh McCall. And the standard story about Charlotte's banks, if you listen to Hugh McCall talk about his motivation in wanting to create one of the largest banks in the country, is he talked a great deal about a sense of Southern inferiority and the dependence that Southern industrialists felt when they had to travel north to borrow money to expand, because there simply were no large Southern sources of capital at the time when Hugh McCall was growing up. And so he speaks at great length about the motivation of ending this dependence in building one of the nation's largest banks. And you don't need me to tell you that was incredibly successful. And it was so successful, in fact, that looking back on the financial crisis, Warren Buffett was commenting on Ken Lewis and the Bank of America purchase of Merrill Lynch. And Warren Buffett said of Ken Lewis that he was the man who saved global capitalism, which is no small praise for a banker from Tryon Street. However, Warren Buffett tempered his praise of Ken Lewis in his very next sentence when he said, "I'm not sure he did it intentionally." And I think it's a fair question to ask, independent of the merits of Mr. Buffett's opinions. Would he have said that about a CEO of a non-Southern company? Needless to say, it didn't go all that well. With that, just those two examples of how the global interacts and often contributes to the Southern, I'll turn things over to our next author, David Walters. And it's our hope here tonight that this conversation will allow us to uncover some more of the complexities of this relationship between the global and the Southern. And in doing so, that will hopefully tell us a little bit more about where Charlotte is headed as we move forward. So thank you all again for coming out.
Well, good evening, everybody. I'm not sure whether I represent global or Southern. I come from Southern England. I'm very proud of that. And I've never, ever worked. I've been here 25 years. I've never worked north of the Mason-Dixon line. So that gives me some, but I don't eat grits. Sorry. there's a story. I was introduced to them as Mississippi ice cream because I worked in Starkville, Mississippi for many years. And of course, ice cream, my taste buds would go in. And I eat grits and something happens and I've never managed to overcome that. So, what I'm here to talk about this evening, though, is really a sort of interrelationship between the global and the southern in terms of our place here, Charlotte, North Carolina, as we heard very articulately expressed this morning on the Mike Collins show, that we're not a global city, but we're a globalizing city, and that means we're in competition with many, many other cities, which means that we can't stop evolving, developing, changing. And my small piece of the book lays out what I think to be a real conundrum with our recent history and our present condition in terms of how we are thinking about, well, how we're thinking about our city and how we are actually building and developing our city. Essentially, centers versus edges. As we know, we have one of the most vital and wonderful downtowns of any southern city. We also have as many of the problems around the suburban periphery as any other city. In fact, Windy Ridge, which is the illustration on the far side from me, has been featured nationally as one of the problem childs of the foreclosure neighborhood issue. And this really poses for us a fundamental question, irrespective of where we've come from, and that's always very important, but where are we going? If you think of our competitor cities, Denver, Portland, Seattle, the list goes on. And if you look what they're facing challenges and they're dealing with the future in a different way. We're at a crucial point. There was a meeting today of which I don't know the outcome of the Metropolitan Transit Commission, which is trying to deal with establishing a map of our future in terms of the transportation infrastructure, which will either take us into the future or keep us stuck in the present while everybody else moves forward. So we're at a really important point, and the stuff in the when we look at the slide, the stuff in the red is important, right? I mean, it's like a will the world wait for us while we sort ourselves out? Because we're doing some things incredibly well, and we're doing other things not very well at all. Our recent history of planning policies is conflicted. I'm sort of pulling my punches there. It's more than that. It's crazy. We are doing two opposite things at the same time, and just imagining that it'll sort of work out. We are, we're focusing things on the center and sub-centers, and we're actually doing multimodal mixed-use development at the same time as we're building completely car-dependent suburbs, both residential, commercial, and retail, which only work when we drive our car with cheap gas. And that may last for a few more years, but not for long. And this is the key question. Can we, we know how to do downtown. We've been blessed with civic and business leaders with vision. We've been blessed with good professionals who have manifested, from the development to the design to the financing aspects of development. We've got downtown down. We've got plenty of challenges, but we know what we're doing. We don't know what we're doing in the suburbs. How many of us live in the suburbs? It's going to be difficult because essentially the way we've conceptualized the suburbs for 50 years is based on driving a car with cheap gas. And while technology may perhaps save us, it's not a good bet. And what other cities are exploring, and we're sort of exploring in some ways, are ways of of actually making our suburbs more sustainable. That means retrofitting them with transit options, with mobility options, retrofitting them so people can age in place where they live, retrofitting them with places of employment and shopping where you can walk or with a very short drive, achieve your daily needs. These are examples from a recent West Coast visit by my urban design studio. And this is actually Denver, where a Grayfield site, an old defunct shopping mall, 55 acres, has been redeveloped as a town center at a higher density. Now, how many of you would vote for high density development in the suburbs? Okay, get out there and tell people that's a good idea. I have been in public meetings for 2 decades where you dodge the tomatoes and the arrows and the slings of outrageous fortune, etc. Because if there's one thing most people who live in the suburbs dislike, it's density. And yet, mixed use and density is really the answer. If we're going to retrofit the suburbs, and this is what I outline, I lay the basis in the chapter for the question, and so I'm extrapolating, I'm taking advantage of you. I'm extrapolating from what I say in the book to suggest that we have some really tough choices ahead of us. But they can't be that tough. I mean, why can Portland do it and we can't? Right? I mean, are they a different nation? Is the IQ level there higher? All right? So there's no reason why we can't learn. If there's one thing I've learned, though, however, from 20 years of working in the South, if you give people an example from Portland, most people don't like it. So you won't like this either, because it's from outside Portland. But I've been going through a series of simply stated but very difficult strategies of how we can retrofit the suburbs so we can live more sustainably, so that we have a good opportunity of remaining competitive in the global economy. Because if we're not, then we're actually going to slide into second, third. Now, I come from Britain, right? We were once the most important nation. I know what it's like to slide from first place down to being a little island off the coast of Europe. Or as, once upon a time, there was fog in the English Channel, and I was waiting for a ferry to go over to France. Announcement came on, because of the fog, we regret to announce that Europe is cut off from Britain. But that's a very Anglo-centric view. The rest of the world doesn't see it like that. And so, we are in competition, not just with Portland. It just so happens I've been to Portland in Seattle recently. And so, with this talk in mind, I use those slides. But there are many cities in competition with us. And as you know, when you're in competition in any venue of your life, you've got to keep moving. You've got to keep thinking. You have to keep planning ahead. And the 4 scenarios that I've very briefly outlined are all technically perfectly possible, and some cities are doing them. And so this is really our challenge. What does this require? Regional planning framework. Big government. But strong codes and ordinances. Don't you tell me what to do in my land. Citizen understanding of the urgency. Lifestyle changes. Drive less. Walk more. This is a forward-thinking developers. Now, there are some. In fairness, no. In fairness to the development, I mean, we wouldn't live in houses if it wasn't for developers, right? So the development community is a vital part of this discussion, and there are, in the Charlotte area, a number of very forward-thinking developers, but they're in a minority. And maybe they don't put as much money into the election coffers of various officials, but I won't go there. I do go there in the book, but I'm not going to go there now. Public investment in infrastructure. I read a depressing list of governors in waiting after the recent elections who are chomping at the bit to cut funding for high-speed rail. That seems to be one of the favorite targets of the incoming power bloc in Washington. Updated tax structure, that's me being, tax increase. Who'll vote for that? But the future is not free. I mean, are we real? Does America want the future on the cheap? Spain is investing billions of dollars. Spain's one of the 6 economies of Europe. It's investing many more billions of dollars than we are to make the best high-speed rail system in Europe. And that pales in comparison with the Chinese investment. You'll be able to go from Shanghai to Beijing at 250 miles an hour in 4 hours. That's from Chicago to New York. Amtrak, 22 hours, 15 minutes. Are we number one? Are we hell? Political will, elected officials. I mean, you can laugh at what I say. I say it so you can laugh. But it's so serious. If we don't demand our political elected officials deal with these issues, then not only will Charlotte not be a globalizing city, America might even follow Britain.
That's David Walters, and he has a book, Designing Communities, if you want to read more in depth from the Charlotte NC Global Evolution of a New South City. Let me, at this moment, bring up the, you guys can walk up, right? It's okay. Derek Alderman and Ron Mitchelson, who are geographers from East Carolina University, affiliated with, among other things, the Center for Sustainable Tourism. And they are going to talk about a car-centric subject, NASCAR.
Guess it's time to change gears, right? It's a conversation, not a wake. All right. There we go. I want to introduce Ron Mitchelson, my colleague and co-author. And I want to thank Heather and Bill for having us. We're flattered to be here. And I want to thank all of you for coming out. This is my second time coming to speak to the museum or at the museum, and I'm impressed every time I come, so I really appreciate the invitation. Hopefully this won't be the last invitation. Okay. It's really pretty easy to see that it's pretty hard to talk about Charlotte without talking about stock car racing or racing in general. It permeates the culture, the landscape, the identity of the city. It even affects the drivers. As we were coming in today from Greenville, we barely made it here. Maybe that's a commentary more on our driving than Charlotte's. As you can see, it also dominates the economy of the region. It's very important economically in terms of revenue, in terms of jobs. Ron and I have been spending the last several months, couple years, thinking about this relationship between NASCAR and Charlotte and trying to understand what it is. And one of the terms that we tried to coin is NASCAR Valley. And NASCAR Valley is a term that refers to this very intense locational clustering of the industrial activities of NASCAR, the cultural activities of NASCAR in and around the Charlotte area. I think the issue of community is pretty appropriate tonight, because what we would ask you to do, if you think about your relationship with NASCAR in terms of the city, is think about NASCAR Valley as a community of sorts. It's a knowledge community in the sense that NASCAR is this huge gathering place where race teams and mechanics and engineers exchange and interact with each other, develop technology, develop and produce information. It's also a memory community in the case where a lot of tourists come, visitors as well as locals come, and they want to learn about the history of NASCAR, the history of stock car racing. And we're going to talk a little bit about the nature of those communities, as well as how that whole notion of NASCAR Valley started, and that's where Ron will come in. But we just want you to get an idea that you see it every day, and what we want to try to do is cast a little bit of light on how it came to be and what perhaps is a community conversation, the implications of that strong concentration of stock car racing with Charlotte. One of the things I want to point out to you is that we had the very first strictly stock car race in NASCAR in Charlotte in 1949, and NASCAR's changed a great deal. It's moved from its traditional southern base to being the fastest growing national sport in the U.S. And you can see from this map showing the changing location of tracks that host the major league races from 1970 to what's projected to be for the 2011 season. Stock car racing has even made its way into Indianapolis Motor Speedway, the fabled home of open wheel racing. And this scene here is pretty symbolic of these guys kissing the bricks. This is Jimmy Johnson kissing the bricks, almost in a ritualistic sense, paying homage to that track. And years ago, that track was not even part of the schedule. One of the things I think is really important to keep in mind is that in the midst of this changing geography of the race day spectacle and this dispersal of NASCAR, Charlotte remains sort of the industrial cultural home of the industry. And so in that regard, it goes back to what Bill was getting at the beginning of this session, which is that you can have global, national change at the same time that you have, in fact, regional ideas staying relevant and regions staying relevant. So this idea that global and regional and national and regional somehow are mutually exclusive isn't always the case. Ron and I just recently collated a pretty sizable, comprehensive database of racing-related firms and establishments in North Carolina, over 800 of them. And we mapped out some of these to show you an example of how concentrated racing-related activity is in the Charlotte area. The top image up here is related to racing-related employment, and you can see the real strong concentration in this region. And then this down here is the sales revenue from racing-related enterprises. And again, it really just, the sheer magnitude of it communicates to you how important NASCAR is to the regional as well as the local economy. If you look a little bit more specifically, whether you split it up in terms of employment or in terms of sales revenue from these racing-related firms, what we find is that NASCAR Valley, this clustering of activity, seems to be very much a cohesive arc from Mooresville to Concord. Mooresville promotes itself as Race City, and then Concord associated with Lowe's Motor Speedway. And consistently, this comes out as a major region. If you go a little bit, I think, finer scale, this is a map showing Mooresville, and you can actually see how closely aligned some of these racing-related firms are. They're literally next-door neighbors, and they're just a stone's throw away from each other. And I don't think it's by accident, in fact, that race shops are next-door neighbors to paint shops. Race shops are next-door neighbors to engineers. Our race shops are next-door neighbors to museums that often host some of the tourists and fans that want to visit their favorite race teams. To let you know, put a little bit more of a global spin on this, NASCAR Valley within Charlotte has an international corollary. You go to Great Britain, they have British Motorsports Valley, and in fact, our attempt to call NASCAR Valley was actually inspired by this phenomenon in Europe. In this case, though, it's actually built around Formula One racing rather than the stock car racing. But I guess what I'm getting at is that as we think about Charlotte's global connections, we have yet another piece of evidence of how what we see in Charlotte is in fact part of a bigger global pattern. So I'm going to turn this over to Ron.
We heard a minute ago that cities compete, and NASCAR didn't have to end up in Charlotte. It had some pretty tough competition, stiff competition from a couple of southern cities, most notably Atlanta. The competition between Atlanta and Charlotte is pretty well known in the South, and this is no exception. One of the reasons it ends up in Charlotte is because of the long history of boosterism associated with racing. Open wheel Indy style racing was taking place in Charlotte in the 1920s. This is a wooden track made of cypress and pine. Didn't last very long, about 3 years. But this kind of investment, huge investment, there are only about 2 or 3 of these in the entire country, got some interest in this kind of sport and the revenues that might be associated with it for the city. One of the key ingredients in this competition was sort of the history of moonshining. NASCAR is pretty tightly lined up with this particular history. 2 particular routes of flow of moonshine, corn whiskey, from Dawson County, North Georgia, into Atlanta, and from Wilkes County into Charlotte. And those 2 were the source of competition. They were certainly the places where the best mechanics and the best drivers were sort of assembled in order to get that liquid gold to the cities. The geography of that moonshining was crucial in setting up this competition. In the Atlanta case, it was a very concentrated crew, very successful crew, by the way, a dominant crew, based on souped-up Fords and lots of horsepower and different suspensions. Raymond Parks was from Dawsonville. Red Vogt was his car builder and engine builder, and he had drivers like Red Byron here and Roy Hall. And this was the Atlanta crew. Very concentrated, very specialized. That specialization, that concentration of ownership would come back to haunt them, because in the case of Charlotte, it was a very diverse group, both in terms of the makes of cars that are being used and the nature of the drivers. Some of them bootleggers, some of them not. Some of them were bus drivers. Some of them were bread truck drivers. So a very big diversity here in terms of the types of individuals, drivers and mechanics who were involved in the Charlotte scene, much different than the Atlanta concentration. So as a result of some of this activity, then Carolina drivers in general dominated this sport early on in its history over this little 45-year period that we're showing. About 60 to 65% of the NASCAR champions were North Carolina drivers. Another aspect of this was the density of red clay tracks. I mean, they were all over this Piedmont landscape. And so the density of drivers, the density of tracks, that red clay being some regard the perfect racing surface, certainly prevailed. Here we have the old number 11 White Lightning racing on Southern States grounds here. Here's that first race that Derek mentioned in 1949. This is an important thing because NASCAR opens in 1949 with this race, and the winner is disqualified. So the winner, Dunaway was his name, Glenn Dunaway, basically took NASCAR to court. NASCAR won. It won its ability to regulate this industry very tightly. That's part of the competition, of course. Mechanics and engineers trying to figure out how to beat NASCAR, if nothing else. They also won that court case. They lost the court case to the owners back there of those houses who wanted their houses repainted after the red dust covered them. They lost that court case. Here's what really got it off the ground. This is the famous Holman Moody shop in Charlotte. Almost any car builder, engine builder of the time came out of this shop, and they're just famous. They brought the technology with them as they moved from one shop to another. This became the local context, the local buzz, the exchange of information, the type of knowledge community. This was crucial in the establishment of and the confirmation of Charlotte as the center of this very highly technical cluster. Soon thereafter, Curtis Turner and Bruton Smith built this speedway that became Lowe's Motor Speedway. First race in May of 1960. Of course, it's very, very well known as one of the premier venues in the NASCAR suite. Bruton Smith, of course, would come to own a large variety of these tracks. I think Speedway Motorsports Inc. now, SMI, now owns 8 tracks worth $1 billion. Annual revenues of $600 million located here in Concord. The knowledge community that we're speaking of is intense. Most knowledge communities, so this one didn't start by accident, it won. It won against Atlanta. But there certainly is a local buzz associated with this, the mechanics, the engineers who share their information, sometimes knowingly, sometimes not, moving between. Sometimes it's a transaction, sometimes it's not. But they're all very similar producers, and they're very highly specialized. And they've come to cluster here. Almost any one of the premier shops, the garage mahals, whether it's DEI or Hendrick or Roush Fenway, these things are huge, aren't they? They're 200 to 500,000 square feet, employing 200 to 500 full-time employees. Most of them have 40 to 50 engineers on site to make sure these things go as fast as they can under NASCAR regulation. So the shops are the core of this knowledge community. This is where it happens. They're supported by a large suite of tech. I was really impressed when we started to look at just this collection, this assemblage of services. NASCAR Technical Institute, 150,000 square feet, 40 classrooms, 150 instructors. And if you want to be a mechanic in NASCAR, that's where you have to go. Windshear, which just was completed about 12 to 15 months ago, where you're going to tether one of these cars on a stainless steel belt, move it at 180 miles per hour, and measure the downforce. Just a tremendous, if you've got $4,000, you can rent it for an hour. So this kind of testing and technical, NASCAR keeps its own research and development offices here. The car of tomorrow, which they all race now, was developed in this place. So the technological assemblage, support services. Then there's all kinds of upstream and downstream activities. Suppliers of performance parts, management. We've got automotive development groups. Whether it's an input or an output, there's a tremendous assemblage here of upstream and downstream activities that also provide the revenues and the jobs that we're talking about. The last thing that has sort of assembled here is the media. You know, if you've got this cluster and you want it promoted, then the media comes here. Speed Channel was started out in Bristol, Connecticut, and moved to Charlotte in order to be near this knowledge community. So we see this attractiveness, this center of gravity, just ever growing for this sport. It's also a memory community, and Dr. Alderman's going to illustrate that.
We're running close on time, so I'll try to move through this. In addition to NASCAR being this hub for all this industrial technological activity, it also serves as an important site of heritage, important site of memory. And as we think about this, one of the things that makes NASCAR Valley so important is the heritage tourism that it attracts. And it varies a great deal from visiting museums, souvenir shops, to actually taking tours within shops themselves. Even some people go all the way out to North Wilkesboro, where they no longer race major league races, and just see what's left of the traditional NASCAR that was there. A lot of this is, in fact, a sense of nostalgia, trying to go back to those red clay dust days of traditional racing. And in some ways, this is an interesting case where the regional change or national change and also regional tradition play off of each other. Because often what motivates this tourism is a sense of what has been lost as a result of NASCAR and Charlotte changing in some way. So there's a bit of a nostalgia that motivates this. So even though we can look back on Charlotte and NASCAR and see that things have changed, that actually motivates people to want to connect with that even further. One of the things that's probably at the center of this heritage tourism and this seeking of memory are the drivers and the driver families. They become pivotal parts of connecting or reconnecting with NASCAR memory and history, whether it's the Pettys or the Earnhardts, going the Dale Trail, which takes you through the life of Dale Earnhardt and all the different places that he and his family frequented. Or you can go, in this case, just to let you know, that is a mannequin. That's not Dale Jr. being accosted by those ladies. There, yeah, that's better. Or you can actually visit the statue of Dale there in Kannapolis. One of the things that's important is that within this mythology of Southern stock car racing, drivers are folk heroes. They're working class icons. They, like the cars that they drive, strictly stock, one of us. Many fans believe in this, even as more contemporary drivers are wealthy, celebrities, and decreasingly Southern. So there's a bit of a contradiction that runs through this memory community as it attracts some of these fans. The power of NASCAR and the identification with the sport is inscribed in the very notion and the very names that we put on the landscape, the streets and the way they identified. And in this case, these street names and these road names don't just tell people where to go within the city, they remind them they live in NASCAR Valley. And they reaffirm the importance of those memories and of those people, some of those people that we've already mentioned, in fact. And then the NASCAR Hall of Fame, which is not too far from here, is really the epitome of how NASCAR has developed this memory community centered around Charlotte. And in this case, one of the things that's interesting is it continues to perpetuate an identification with the individual. It's not a museum, it's a Hall of Fame. It's a place of recognizing personalities rather than just the sheer history of NASCAR. What I would suggest to you, since we're engaged in a conversation and thinking about change and where we're going to go or where we could go, the Hall of Fame, while it does sort of reaffirm a traditional notion of NASCAR history, it also has perhaps the seeds for actually getting us to think about NASCAR in a little bit more diverse ways. I like the idea, in fact, that the Hall of Fame has a Martin Luther King address. If you consider the fact the challenges that NASCAR has undergone in terms of attracting diversity, in terms of drivers and fans, if you think about some of the imagery that the sport deals with Confederate flags waving at tracks, that in fact may do something perhaps. Maybe you want to debate that with me about thinking about race and diversity and how this may attract a different kind of fan. Also keep in mind that since the Hall of Fame is open, there's been a lot of discussion about Wendell Scott. I'm fascinated about Wendell Scott. He's the first and only African-American driver to win at the major league level, raced for many years, and a lot of people have been pushing for Wendell Scott to be brought into the Hall of Fame. And NASCAR, in fact, has done some things to honor Scott, even going back as far as to give the family his trophy that was owed to him 47 years ago. He won a race in Jacksonville. They supposedly, another person won. They didn't give him his trophy. They found out later what he won, but then it took him 47 years to actually get the trophy, long after he died. So there's a real interplay of race, memory, and culture that can go along the Hall of Fame as well as just being a typical tourist attraction. Thanks for your time.
We have one more speaker, and then Heather Smith will wrap things up. And again, a very different perspective. I really enjoy the way that our speakers just a moment ago helped us see NASCAR in a new way, to see a new place on the landscape. And Jose Gamez does the same thing looking at immigrant Charlotte. I actually contributed a chapter to this book called Salad Bowl Suburbs, saying, you know, we're not getting Chinatown or a Little Italy or a barrio. Everything's all mixed up. I was sort of able to say that driving down Central Avenue. Jose Gamez, who is a PhD from UCLA, heads the Design and Society Research Center in the Architecture School at UNCC. Jose has gotten out of the car and walked on Central Avenue. Make him welcome, Jose Gamez.
We're going to shift from, super fast trains shooting from wherever to Shanghai, 250 miles an hour, from super fast cars to really slow taco trucks for a few minutes. And you'll forgive me that I warned Heather and Dr. Smith and Dr. Graves that the minute I came up here to speak, their book sales were going to plummet. There'll be book burnings. And so I have some notes that I promise not to read, but they will try to keep me kind of on track. And it's interesting a little bit to think about the kinds of questions that David presented to us, the issues about retrofitting the suburbs, the kinds of challenges that we're facing as a growing city, as a Sunbelt city, as largely a suburban city, right? And one of the things that I'm interested in at the more generalizable level is how we actually start to think about things in the suburban landscape that might allow us to figure out how we retool them, retrofit them, rebuild them, particularly in the ways that we might introduce a public realm that was never designed or implemented in the first place, and how that public realm is already emerging. Because from my experience, it's there, and there are some lessons to be learned. And we just have to find the right way of looking at what I consider to be a kind of invisible landscape in our own landscape. This is not particularly new information, I would say. I draw on a lot of other people's work, but the kind of work that I do as Tom suggested, involves me walking around. So this is my conversation this afternoon, this evening, is really just to give you the context of the kind of work that is showcased in the chapter that I contributed. It really stems from ethnographic research. I'm an architect by training, so I have no right to claim ethnographic skills, but this is what I do because those folks have a lot more fun than architects do when they're doing research. Because you can walk around, right? You can walk around and you can say, hola, yo hablo español, and can I have that taco right there for cheap? And you can spend an afternoon in parts of Charlotte speaking Spanish, right? So I go back to my days in California when I would get stressed out at UCLA and I'd run over to East LA and meet some friends of mine, and we would just blend in. We would get lost in a Spanish landscape that felt incredibly Latin American and yet not. And this is some of the stuff that we're starting to see emerging in Charlotte, right? That the globalization of Charlotte is starting to impact us in certain kinds of ways. Our physical landscapes are starting to show that, but there aren't many physical traces of what that might represent. And the suggestion now has been to bring up my own work. So this is sort of what the opening of the chapter looks like, and it is the opening and the introduction of the chapter is really a snapshot of the field notes that I had. It's a synopsis of me walking around one particular hot afternoon near Central and Rosehaven, the intersections of Central and Rosehaven, and talking to people at this particular intersection, where sometimes, in this instance, you see two different taco trucks sitting on one asphalt parking lot, which we'll get to back in a few minutes, but in the end, at moments you'd see up to 5 at this intersection, 5 taco trucks at this intersection. What you might imagine emerging is a kind of dynamic public landscape that wasn't really expected to be there, and that's really where I start to see some promise for how we might retool our own suburban landscapes. And so this might get back a little bit to David's conversation earlier. Charlotte is globalizing. We've got a lot of flows of forces, cultural and migration and otherwise, that are coming into our landscape. The author of this image is actually sitting back here, Jesse, one of my students in our architecture design studio on campus at the moment. In fact, I think he authored this one as well. That starts to look at the amount of languages and the influences of folks that we have in this landscape. 83% of us speak English as our first language, but according to the Chamber of Commerce's website, 600 different languages, approximately 600 different languages are spoken in Charlotte. In CMS, let me see if I can find my notes, because I want to get this one right. 140 different languages representing 160 different countries of origin, right? Charlotte, CMS is on the forefront of this, as you might imagine, and so this is something that tells us about the future of our city, and we're starting to look at what 2050 might look like relative to some of these language populations. One of the things I pulled from the Chamber of Commerce's website, in addition to those statistics, was a quote that I thought was kind of interesting. If you'll bear with me for a moment. The Chamber of Commerce suggests to us that Charlotte is a multicultural metropolitan area that embraces diverse ideas, opinions, and business operations and residents, such that it might produce and offer an environment that helps foreign-owned firms grow and makes foreign-born workers feel at home. We might come back to that in our conversation later on, but I think what it points out is that the Chamber of Commerce understands the location that this city has in a globalizing map, that we're part of a larger network, we're a destination. We may not be, and I think Dr. Smith and Dr. Graves mentioned this earlier on the radio today, we may not be properly a global city, right? Maybe we don't want that. I think some of the callers calling in maybe suggested that some of that southernness might get lost. And what I would suggest to you is that some of the southernness that we see still has a southern flair to it, a southern accent, a southern flavor, but it might, in this case, in the case of my research, maybe it's southern with a kind of American, Pan-American perspective to it, that we might be South American just as we are southern. So if you go to Central and Rosehaven at this moment in time, what you won't find is this, right? And two things have happened since the writing of the essay, doing the research, and the publication process. Two things have happened. What happened? The economy tanked. We know that, right? So that stemmed some of the flow. It slowed some of the migration tendency, transnational networks. I got to throw a big academic word in there, right? That's what the PhD was for. It stemmed some of those flows momentarily. People are not necessarily leaving, right? But they may be unemployed. And so they're not out in public. And the second thing that happened is that we passed an amazing policy that says taco trucks can't be within 400 feet, or mobile vendors, I should say, can't be within 400 feet of a residential structure, and they can't be within 400 feet of another vendor, mobile vendor, right? So we've created a situation on Central Avenue where this can't happen. Because at this particular intersection, both of these trucks are too close to each other by policy, by law, and they're too close to residential fabric that's right behind this commercial strip. So that's kind of moved from that instance. That is an issue, right? If we're a multicultural, diverse metropolitan landscape that fosters an environment for international workers that is welcoming, well, this is a policy that might be at odds with that. Now, there are a lot of reasonable reasons why this policy became a point of contention for a lot of folks, but maybe we can come back to that later on with our conversation point. But at the moment, our policy doesn't allow this. This is a non-conforming use, to use planning terminology, right? What I'm interested in is what that non-conforming use actually introduces to the landscape. A landscape that was not designed to have a public realm, a landscape that was lacking in public infrastructure and yet acts as a public space, right? So what are those elements, right? We get an existing urban artifact, this aging strip center, 7-Eleven style space that has become a multi-unit storefront that you can get a cell phone package, you can wire money, you can get a notary, you can get your fresh baked goods, and you can buy a hat that I talk about in the front end of my essay, and a soda pop. You get taco trucks as urban props that begin to actually physically shape space in a certain way, but they add another amenity, they add program, they add a resource that people might like, they might want, and that begins to attract people. And what you start to get in the end are actual people showing up in the asphalt landscape of our suburban parts of the city. And I describe this as a suburban part of the city because it is, right? It's an aging, auto-oriented piece of our urban landscape that has now been overgrown by yet successive rings of suburban development. And at some point, we've got to come back in and repair these things. This is the retrofit that David was beginning to talk about earlier. It's not at the scale of the work of Portland, Oregon, so we can't be like Portland here, except maybe we can, because Portland has a different policy relative, for example, to mobile vendors for exactly this kind of site. We could talk about that as well later. But this is what I'm interested in, is the kinds of activities that actually begin to transform and hybridize our urban landscapes, in part as a result of cultural practice. That people show up with a certain kind of expectation of how they can act in public, how we might comport ourselves in a public realm, and yet there's no physical public landscape for them to occupy. And they begin to create, remap, and rearticulate the public sector simply through habit, through social action, through public expressions of culture. And this is where our city starts to reflect that transnational globalization that folks have been talking about, that culture begins to be hybridized, that cultures show up and they respond to a physical place, and they, by extension, begin to adapt and transform and translate that physical landscape to become something else. And it doesn't always require architecture, at least at this moment. But my suggestion is that they might tell us something about how we can begin to think about architecture and urban design as we move forward at a slightly different scale than most of our conventional development practices that we see happening in many other parts of the city. So these are the kinds of things that I think the invisible city might represent for us, that we could take as a starter point for a kind of toolkit. A toolkit that we could use to apply to other landscapes, a toolkit that we could use to retrofit the inner ring suburban, the middle belt suburban landscapes that are really the receptors, the gateways of our immigrant landscape in most of our Sun Belt cities, Charlotte being one of them. We're not unlike Los Angeles in that sense. We're not unlike Phoenix in that sense, or Atlanta. We're at a different state of growth than any of those cities, and we're at a different state of immigration pattern than those cities. So we're looking at a city that is a laboratory for immigration trends, a laboratory for redevelopment and retrofit of the suburban landscape, and we're at a point, given this is the upside of the economic downturn, right? We're at a point where we can take a breather and say, hey, there are some things about the city we like that we could concentrate on. There's some things about the city that we don't like that we can try to fix. And maybe some of those things that are kind of contentious represent not necessarily non-conforming habits, but simply differences of cultural understanding. And as a diverse, cosmopolitan, metropolitan, globalizing city, we might begin to consider exactly the kinds of things that the previous presentation ended on. What does diversity mean for the local heritage? How do we be Southern while we're still globalizing? And my suggestion is that there is a way of maintaining a sensibility about place that might respond to the kinds of things that we see emerging in a lot of our landscapes precisely because they represent what a geographer called Doreen Massey describes as a global sense of place, right? We're not just Southern any longer, but there is a Southern flair to what happens in this landscape, right? That is something we can learn from. It's something we should not ignore. This is what cultural theorist Homi Bhabha might describe as the location of culture. This is one way to locate culture. If you read his book, it'll be completely confusing. And not once is there a fixed location in that book about what culture might be. But what he's describing is, in fact, how culture is performative. Right? Culture actually takes place, that it acts in a certain way in response to physical landscapes in time and in space. And it captures it, takes over, and creates a kind of insurgent landscape out of something that might not have been intended to be that in the first place. And these are things that we're at sort of the recipients, the beneficiaries of an emerging landscape that allows us to look at what's happening. It's happened in other ways, in other places. We can look at it happening now and learn from other places, and we can look at what's happening now and capitalize upon the positive attributes that these trends might represent for us. I've strayed far from my notes, and I don't even know where they are anymore. But I think I'll end on that, because I know we're pressed for time a little bit, so thank you.
I'm having a good time. I keep thinking of new stuff on account of the fact that these people are bringing up new ways of looking at the world. And the person, along with Bill Graves, who brought them all together is Dr. Heather Smith, and she is going to sum up here for just a moment. Is Charlotte a global city?
No. That's right. I will be actually brief. Thank you very much for coming this evening. Our panelists have addressed a very small subset of the strands of globalization that are impacting Charlotte's contemporary and future transition. The book, of course, includes at least 12 other contributors, many of whom are here with us tonight. And so as we begin to segue the formal part of this program into the actual conversation part of the program, I would encourage you to engage these authors and ask them questions about their work on the retrofitting of, for example, old mills to meet the needs of the cultural new class, a growing component of our population. The way in which creative and global thinking leadership, corporate citizenship, and innovation have led to unique forms of revitalization and gentrification in our uptown communities. The way in which innovation, right, entrepreneurship, not necessarily traditional Southern norms, not tradition, has translated into steady but often unrecognized progress. It's my job to bring this evening to a rapid close, right, Tom? Very rapid. So I only want to reiterate 2 points that have been repeated throughout the presentations this evening. The first is, Charlotte, according to the authors in this book, is not a global city. It is a globalizing one. And our goal with this project was to use each of these chapters to identify one of the threads of that globalizing process and to provide more detail, more background about what that thread looked like and how it contributed to the development of what we think perhaps is a unique, distinctively Southern, potentially distinctively Charlottean form of globalization. We're particularly interested in this project, all of us, in how the globalizing forces of change encounter the Southern forces of change and how the two actually interact and change one another. The second point that I would make, also pointed out over the course of these presentations, is that as a process, globalization is not static. It's always moving, it's always changing, it's unpredictable. So as a city, as we begin to think about these threads, these strands of globalization, and how it is that the city is going to move forward, and we're thinking about making decisions about how we're going to realign our school system, about how it is that we're going to develop our suburbs, how it is that we're going to densify our center city landscapes, whether or not we are going to become a city of welcome or exclusion to international newcomers, we need to be mindful that we can move both up and down the globalization hierarchy. And so to get to my slides and not Jose's, really, really briefly, right, Charlotte, not a globalizing city. Here is a slide for those of you who are not visually challenged, right, that is actually the 2008 ranking from the Globalization and World Cities Research Council out of the United Kingdom. What you'll notice on this 2008 ranking is that Charlotte is not an alpha world city, it's not a beta world city, it's not a gamma world city. It is a high sufficiency city, and it's fairly low down on the list. I would make the point that if you took a look at this list in the year 2000, Charlotte actually would be positioned on the gamma global city list. So in the same way that we can move up the global hierarchy, and I think that the chapters in our book and our book as a whole really focuses on that progression, we need to be mindful as we are making the choices about our future that we can also fall beneath it. So with those things to think and ponder about, I'm going to turn it back to Tom.